Hi, you join us today on the River Ribble in Lancashire, just outside Preston. Our cameraman Ian Chapman put us onto this venue and it's already proving to be absolutely awesome. We're catching wonderful dace like this on the waggler. So we're going to have a look at a bit more detail about the methods used when we're fishing a waggler for dace on a river such as this. As with fishing on all rivers, one of the most important factors is swim selection. And we've actually walked quite a long way from the car park to pick this peg today. And I think that's a really key thing when you think about fishing on rivers, especially in the winter. As you can see, the river's quite wide here, but one of the key features is there's a channel just sort of out in the middle that gives us a greater depth of water, and that's where the fish are congregating and holding, especially in the winter when the temperatures drop. So fish location is such an important factor, and using local tackle shops and local fishermen really can save you a lot of time and ensure that you're fishing on fish straight away. So as I say, fish location is so important, and around about 100 metres below this peg there's a lot of shallow sections which wouldn't really be very good to fish on a day like this. So as the river's a spate river, it's really essential to find these deeper pools where the fish are hanging out. So as you can see, it's been a very, very cold, frosty morning, and with the river being very low and clear, I think the fact that this area is so good is given to the point of these high banks that we've got. It provides a lot of shelter for the fish and prevents the sunlight from getting on the water for much of the day. So even though it's cold for fishing, I think that's actually a great factor when you're selecting a swim like this. When you're fishing a river and having sport like this, it's so important to realise the species that you're targeting. And I think the dace has got to be one of the best fish for targeting on a cold winter's day like this. Dace will feed in cold water temperatures when others won't. So when you can't catch a roach or maybe a chub or a barbel, you can pretty much always rely on a dace. And the other great factor with focusing on dace on a day like this is the fact that they will shoal up. So, you know, you're going to have a good chance of putting a good weight together of these absolute cracking, hard fighting fish. The dace I've been catching today have been between about 4 and 10 ounce, and they're absolutely in perfect condition. Fin perfect, they look like they've never been caught before. Because of the shallow nature of the bank here, I've had to wade out around about 15 foot into the river just to enable me to be able to fish efficiently. And obviously being able to do that is so important when you're trying to amass a good bag of dace like we are today. So in order to maximise the efficiency, what I've decided to do is bring my box out with all my gear and terminal tackle and bait, but I'm also utilising this waist apron, which is absolutely fantastic when you're fishing on rivers and you're standing and fishing the float like this. On such a shallow peg like this, and again to maximise the efficiency, I actually prefer to stand up and fish with a bait apron, a bit old school, as opposed to sitting down on the box. I just think it makes everything much easier and much more enjoyable. Another advantage, of course, of wading out like this, apart from making it easier for the fishing, is I can get the net into some deeper water, which is obviously a consideration when you're catching a good net of fish like this. Okay, so let's have a look at the tackle that we're using today. The rod I've selected is the Super Team 13-foot match. It's an absolute perfect length for fishing on a river like this, where you're not casting too far and you've not got much depth. It's a beautiful slim rod with a nice soft tip and a progressive action. I've coupled it up with an 035 Super Team reel, which is obviously an open face reel, and the reel line I've put on there is this diameter 16 Mac XT mono. So it's a nice balanced line which floats well and also balances with the hook length, which is made from the same material, and in this case I'm using 012. I actually started with 010, but as the fish have responded so well, I've been able to step up to 012 hook length. The hooks that I've settled on has been between the Drennan red maggot hooks in a size 16 and size 14, and also the old classic Kamasan B520 in a size 14. I find with Dace you need to use a micro barb. With barbless hooks you'll bump a lot of fish as the fish twist and turn. But one tip that I do is I always squeeze the barb down with some style pincers. I think that helps with the bait presentation, and it seems to give you enough of a barb to stop the dace from bouncing off. The floats I'm using are straight wagglers. Basically because of the depth of the water and the distance that I'm casting, I've switched between a 3AA and a 2.5 AA. The straight waggler's a great waggler when you're catching like this and it's fast and furious, and also when the light's bad it's difficult to see an insert waggler, so that's why I've selected one of these straight Dave Harrell wagglers today. We had a bit of a problem early on in the session with the line freezing in the rod guides, and I've actually had to fish a slightly heavier float than I would do to help me to get the line through that situation. But now that the ice has thawed, I'm going to probably switch down to a 2.5 AA waggler so that I restrict the splash on the water when I'm casting and also improve the presentation. So as you can see, I've got the bulk shot situated around the float. I've got a couple of number 8s to bring down into play if I need to and change the presentation, and then I've got the 2 number 10s together and then another 2 number 10s below that. The hook length's about 30 or 40 centimetres, and again I've varied that during the session depending on how the fish have been feeding. Sometimes if you're missing a lot of bites it's important to get your telltale shot down closer to the hook, but I found that to be round about perfect today. And I've also found by bulking up those dropper shot, I've been able to read the bites a lot better. So if I get a bite that intercepts the bait on the way down, the float holds up and doesn't settle. And obviously I've got a chance to watch that settle and then the float dot down to a very sensitive pimple. And another really good tip that I think when you're fishing like this, even though the fishing's prolific, to help you miss bites, when I'm dotting the float right down, I'll actually put some of this fluorescent bristle grease onto the top of the float, which I think helps improve the visibility, but it also means that I can have such a delicate presentation with the float dotted right down to that tiny pimple. Of course, with all fishing and certainly river fishing, feeding's got to be the most important aspect. And what we actually did today when we got here was just start feeding before we actually fished for about 10 or 15 minutes, just to introduce some bait into the swim and get some fish feeding. And then we've gradually started to increase the feed and the frequency once the fish have arrived. You'll notice that I'm actually feeding slightly downstream of me, and that's quite important, especially once the fish have arrived, because I want to be as efficient as possible. I want to get my rig out into the feed in the most optimum way, and that's by feeding downstream, casting past the feed and then drawing the float back into the feed. If I was casting upstream or feeding upstream and casting upstream, I'd find it much more difficult to present the bait efficiently and effectively. It's much easier to be able to float fish and get the line behind the float and present the bait correctly when you're casting slightly downstream. So, although the dace are feeding really well, they can be notoriously fast biting. So it's important to get into a rhythm and employ a few key tactics. So as you can see, I'm casting and then feeding whilst I'm holding the rod, so I can control the float straight away and strike at any bites. But also I'm creating a zone where I'm feeding. It's over quite a general area. So what I can do is, if I miss a bite like that, I can continue and maybe get 2 or 3 bites out of the cherry if I do miss a few bites. And obviously, again, when it comes to river fishing, the frequency is so important. So I'll sometimes feed 2 or 3 times a cast to get the fish feeding up in the water and competing for the bait. It's much easier to fool the fish that way rather than feeding infrequently or in greater amounts. So I'm just casting out to the middle of the river, feathering the line and the float so that it all straightens out nicely. And then I'm firing 10 to 20 maggots out, and then I'm pulling the float into the feed. Sometimes with the dace, you actually find that you hook a fish automatically, so you haven't seen a bite, you've cast, the bait's falling through the water, and then you strike to move the float into position, and there you go, you've got a fish. So it's a very, very active style of fishing, but it's such great fun when you get the dace feeding, and you can amass some fantastic weights of dace. A great skill to have when you're fishing the waggler like this on a river is to be able to feed with the catapult in your hand while you're holding the rod. You see, it can be difficult to feed doing that, but it saves so much time when you hit more bites over putting the rod down on a rod rest and then feeding and picking the rod up again. As the sessions progress, we've been able to catch the fish up in the water, and as you can see, I'm only actually fishing there between 2 and 3 foot deep. It's obviously important to keep varying the depth to keep in touch with the fish, but when the dace are really feeding, you'll find that they'll come up in the water. So as the fish are feeding up in the water, I'm obviously not going to have much shot down the line, because I want the bait to act very naturally and fall as slowly as possible. So in this case, I've actually got 4 number 10s down the line, and I've actually bulked 2 together so that it gives me a good bite registration as well. These dace just fight like mad and twist and turn all the way in. But what a beautiful fish, absolutely fin perfect. They look like they've never been caught before. I found today that the best bait's double maggot. And I think the great thing about using 2 maggots, especially when you're fishing for dace like this, is you can get more bites from the cherry if you keep missing bites and you've got more bait basically staying on the hook. So it's certainly worth bearing in mind when the fishing starts to get a bit harder to maybe drop down to a single maggot, and especially if you're missing bites on a double maggot. But when you really want to amass a good weight of fish like this, you can keep going with 2 maggots. And actually, if I can, I won't rebait. I'll try and catch 2 or 3 fish on 2 maggots. I prefer to, when fishing double maggot, to fish one through the top of the head and one through the tail. And I think this has 2 key advantages. One, it prevents the line from spinning as you're constantly retrieving the bait back. But the other is, I think you bump less fish. If you hook both of the maggots through the head, you can find that there's a lot of meat around the point, and the maggot tends to, one maggot can fold over the other, meaning that you'll bump the fish. And as the session progresses, you'll find that the fish will move around just around the peg. So you need to search around the peg if you're not getting any bites. In this case, the fish have dropped a little bit further down the peg. So I'm having to run the float down a bit further to keep in touch with them. But by regular feeding, I should bring the fish back up again and back into that deadly catching zone just downstream of where I'm feeding. So even though I'm feeding 2 or 3 times a cast, I'm varying the amount of maggots that I'm feeding as well. To start with, I was feeding quite heavily until the fish arrived, and then I've cut back on the feed and almost tried to get some competition going and hopefully catch more fish on your bait. So by feeding maybe up to 20 maggots like that, I'm attracting the fish, holding them there, but not overfeeding them. I think if you were to feed a lot of bait today, with it being so cold, you could very quickly overfeed the fish. So it's a fine balance really between feeding enough bait to keep the fish there or overfeeding them. Okay, I'm going to call it a day with that final dace. I've had around about 100 dace for 30 to 40 pounds. What beautiful fish they are, and what an awesome venue the River Ribble is.